Noon. Very, very exciting program. Lots of interesting things have been taking place in the Korean Peninsula, especially within the past 2 weeks. So let me turn the program over to Troy Stangarone, who is our Senior Director of Congressional Affairs. Troy?
Thank you, Congressman Manzullo. And as everyone knows, on Friday, President Moon Jae-in of South Korea and Kim Jong-un of North Korea met for the first time in the DMZ. Prior to that, Kim Jong-un had met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and he is also taken and going to meet with President Trump here at perhaps in 3-4 weeks or so. So there's a lot going on the Korean Peninsula right now. Things have changed. We move into what I sort of see as an era of summit diplomacy. But we're fortunate today. We're working with Sasakawa, and I'd like to thank Ambassador Zumwalt for joining us and doing this event today. But there's a lot, I think, to unpack in terms of all of these events that are going on. And we're fortunate to have an expert panel here to discuss this with us. To my immediate left, and everyone has all the speakers' bios, so I'm just going to very briefly introduce them. I have Taisuke Miyabe. He's a visiting fellow at the Scrowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. Next to him, I have Scott Snyder, who's the senior fellow for Korea Studies and the director for the program on U.S. Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Next to Scott is Jung Pak, who is the senior fellow and SK Foundation chair in Korean Studies at the Brookings Institution. Next to her is Ambassador Zumwalt, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. And then next to Ambassador Zumwalt is Mark Tokla, who is Vice President here at KAI. So what I'd like to do, Ambassador Zumwalt, is start off with you. In the past, we've dealt with North Korea essentially from a bottom-up process. Now we're working top-down through a series of what ideally would be interlocking summits. There's reason why this process might break down, though the first summit seemed to have gone well. But how do you envision this working out if it actually works?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Troy and Mark and Congressman Manzullo, for the great cooperation. Just by way of brief background, I worked in the State Department for 36 years, and one of the main things I was trying to work on was improving Japan-ROK relations. So it's great in the private sector to see the collaboration between KEI and Sasakawa. I think we're modeling good behavior here. So thank you very much for that. But to get to your question, I think, it's interesting because I think there's been so much skepticism in Washington about North Korea's recent diplomatic agenda and its efforts. And I think it is worth at least thinking about, okay, what would the path to success be and how might that work? So even though I share much of the skepticism, I want to sort of set that skepticism aside to answer this question. And I think the first thing that both the United States and the Republic of Korea really should do is to explore what sort of concrete first steps might be achievable in order to test the North Korea's statements that they are in favor of denuclearization. So I certainly hope that the U.S. government now, in preparation for the summit that's coming up, is thinking about what sorts of things it might ask for as a good test of that. And the obvious one is how soon can we get IAEA inspectors back inside North Korea? I think it's worth noting that the path forward, should it be successful, is going to be much more difficult than the path that the United States and its 5 partners took with Iran, because North Korea's program is much more advanced and we know much less about it. So the very first step will be just to do an assessment of what exists and what's out there in order to understand the full scale of the program. So I'm certainly hopeful to see some kind of agreement to allow IAEA inspectors to come back and begin that assessment. The second thing that would be important, I think, are some goodwill gestures on both sides. And the sorts of things that would make a lot of sense would be to see return of the American prisoners there, perhaps a restart of efforts on the part of the U.S. military to identify remains of service members who died in the Korean War. That's a nice thing that could be done to generate some goodwill. But I think it's also really important to sustain the pressure, the economic sanctions program that's in place until we start seeing some implementation of some concrete steps. And I am a bit concerned about the North-South statement that appeared to be foreshadowing lots of economic steps without really having much in the way of concrete steps in terms of denuclearization. But also from the United States perspective, we need to work very closely with our allies, Republic of Korea and Japan. I think sometimes as the great power, we tend to neglect or overlook the interests of our allies. And just from a purely selfish point of view, our greatest asset in dealing with this issue are our alliances with the Republic of Korea and Japan. And so we don't want to be diminishing that asset by taking steps that are out of sync with what our allies are doing. And then the final thing I'll just mention, something that will be necessary for success is for the United States government to think about what I call the circle of consultations. There are a whole number of rings that we have to be talking with. I mentioned our allies. That's incredibly important. And we've gotten off to a good start. President Trump met with Prime Minister Abe. There's been phone calls between President Moon, President Trump, Prime Minister Abe, all three directions. So far, that's been very good. But we have a lot more we need to do from the perspective of the U.S. government. We need to be talking to China and Russia, who have their own interests and could play either positive or negative roles. But then we have to think about the consultations within the United States. I mean, if we're serious about talking about ultimately about a peace treaty, we'll need congressional ratification for that. And so the time to start talking to Congress is not at that moment, it's now. And also the time to start talking to foreign policy thinkers from both parties to get their advice is now. Because if we ever were to get to a stage of success, we need to have public support, congressional support, and it's too late at the end of the process to start those consultations. So I would encourage the Trump administration to think about all of these steps that would be needed if we were to have a successful outcome of this process.
So, Jung, we're going to have this very complex process going forward, but over the last couple of years, North Korea significantly ramped up its testing, both of missiles, nuclear tests. Last year, we all thought war might actually be an option. Now, Kim Jong-un is suggesting essentially he's willing to give up his nuclear weapons, that, all he needs is a security guarantee, maybe some other things. Seemingly, these are all things that the United States would have been willing to have given him at any time. So why now?
Thanks, Troy. It's my pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel today. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. This question is often couched as, is Kim coming to the table, engaging is this a sign of strength or is it a sign of weakness? And I think it's both, in that there's some defensive measures and there are offensive measures. It could be that, and it's a basket of things, rather than any one, factor. So on that defensive basket, I would think sanctions and the talk about military strikes, and the fact that sanctions may or may not be biting, or if they're not biting yet, he's at least thinking ahead about a time when they'll bite. But on the offensive basket, it's the fact that President Moon had his hand out, in terms of engaging with the North. There was the opportunity of the Olympics, and the fact that the ICBM tests worked as well as they did last year, and that he might be feeling more confident about dealing, with the U.S. and others from a position of strength. So I think it's a mixture of things. It's not clear to me yet whether that's whether any one factor is the driving factor, but I think we have to think of it in terms of all of the circumstances that are potentially influencing Kim's decision. I also think that Kim might see an opportunity with a liberal progressive government and President Moon Jae-in, as well as the fact that we have a U.S. president who is very open about challenging alliances and and Kim might see this as an opportunity to see this convergence of a liberal government in South Korea and a U.S. government a U.S. president that's suspicious of alliances, as a way to to make inroads on decoupling or luring the South Koreans away from the U.S.
So, Ty, if Kim Jong-un is seriously considering denuclearization, the question that seems to rise to me is there actually, given all of the emphasis been placed on the nuclear program, support amongst North Korean elite for this path?
First of
It's not on.
Okay. Let me express my gratitude to give me this opportunity to talk among as one of these panelists. And first of all, I have to say about waiver that even though I'm now with Atlantic Council as a visiting senior fellow, at the same time, I also belong to the Embassy of Japan as a minister, and I still hold the diplomatic status. But nevertheless, today, what I talk here, does not represent the view of the government of Japan by any means. This is the thing that I have to say clearly. And as for your question, frankly speaking, I don't know if Kim Jong-un is serious for denuclearization or not at this juncture. And nowadays, particularly since the early this year, there are a number of speculations about Kim Jong-un's intention, and there are a number of predictions about the future course. But nobody knows. So what we'd like to propose here is that we become more action-oriented. So we should start with then what we do, not just speculating, what Kim Jong-un is thinking and what just predicting what's going to happen. Since Mr. Zumwalt said that to test the North Korea, I totally agree with him. So in months to come, what we need to do is to test North Korea, to test Kim Jong-un if he is very serious about denuclearization. And if I need to respond to your question, I also have to say that I don't know, if the elites of North Korea support the current change. They might support, but they might not. But I do not rule out any possibility that for example, Kim Jong-un is serious about the denuclearization. But all the more for that reason, the current development can bring about a consequence nobody, including Kim Jong-un himself, did not expect. So some people argue that there might be a moment for Kim Jong-un to be a Deng Xiaoping, but there might be a moment that Kim Jong-un to be Gorbachev. So what I'd like to say is that ice is the most dangerous when it starts to melt.
I don't know if there's truer advice. Scott, we tend to look at this from our perspective and the concerns we have about North Korean sincerity. But, if in the United States there's a view that North Korea has violated prior agreements, how does North Korea perceive the situation?
Well, I think the mistrust is mutual. And, one of the really striking things about the situation that we have been, and I think still are in currently, is that at present there is simply no intersection of interest that the governments between the United States and North Korea have defined that has enabled them to be able to come to talks. And so, if I can build on the conversation where we are so far, I think one value of a top-down approach, especially between anticipating Trump and Kim, is that it actually provides an opportunity for the leaders to, almost take their respective spheres of interest as though they were two circles of light and push them together in order to define a new common project. Because so far, our primary experience has been one of failure with regard to implementing those kinds of projects. And it's because of mutual distrust on both sides. But I think that we're also in a situation, given the way that this has started and the complexity of the issues, where we're going to have a lot of attention and coordination to both horizontal linkages, coordination among governments, and vertical linkages. And here I'm really thinking about the U.S. president and the sort of bureaucratic process that is inevitably going to be necessary in order to hold parties to agreements. Because ultimately, when we deal with Kim Jong-un, it's not going to be an agreement based on trust. We all know that. It's going to be about drawing him out, and I think that's part of what the Inter-Korean Summit did, and binding him, which is actually, I think, in some ways the more challenging thing, to switch his focus from purely domestic to being in the context of an international community that has a common interest in a stable and denuclearized North Korea.
Scott, just to stick with you for a minute, speaking of drawing him out, before the Inter-Korean Summit, Kim Jong-un met with Xi Jinping in China. How does that summit impact the prospect that North Korea could give up its nuclear weapons?
Well, for me, in many respects, the meeting between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping was kind of a missing piece to the puzzle that helps us to gain insight into the North Korean approach to the Inter-Korean Summit, and also to meeting with the United States, because that's a piece that resonates very strongly with what we saw in the year 2000, where Kim Jong-il first went to Beijing, and then he met with the South Koreans. And of course, the reason why he needed to do that is he needed to generate leverage, from a relative position of weakness, in order to engage with South Korea. And I think that it shows that he needs to kind of hedge his bets as he realizes he's being drawn into this process. It doesn't answer the question yet as to whether his primary goal is to buy time or to possibly achieve some other replacement for nuclear weapons as a source of regional security.
So, Mark, sticking, with the China summit, right now you have a situation to where a lot of the economic pressure on North Korea is being applied by China. But at the same time, the United States has recently shifted policy on its trade policy and is now potentially pressuring China over, U.S.-China trade. Do you see this having any potential impact on this broader relationship? And do you think China could choose to loosen pressure on North Korea?
Yeah, thanks, Troy. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me?
Is the green light showing?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm a little bit less concerned about the link between U.S. trade policy and China and North Korea now than it was a month ago. I think things have moved on quite rapidly. At this point, I think China's main concern is to deal itself into the symmetry to the greatest extent possible. So China may see that there's advantages to lightening economic pressure on North Korea to deal itself in, or it may not. It may be China will want to extract some concession from North Korea in exchange for lightening up on economic pressure. So I'm not sure which way that works exactly, except for the fact that Beijing was certainly wrong-footed by the acceptance by President Trump of the Kim Jong-un offer for a summit. Beijing was surprised by that, and Washington was surprised by it, so it's no wonder Beijing was surprised. The other point I would make is that Kim Jong-un emulates his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, in all ways he can. One thing Kim Il-sung was very successful at was playing the Soviet Union off against China. He was able to create space for himself. I think Kim Jong-un is probably at least as interested in being out from under China's thumb as he's worried about the U.S. pressure on North Korea. If that's the case, we may see Kim Jong-un moving to try to balance the United States against China, the way his grandfather balanced China against the USSR.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about this whole process is it's not just a question of everyone meeting with Kim Jong-un now. It's a question of we're all meeting with each other. So in that light, Ambassador Zumwalt, Prime Minister Abe came to Washington, D.C. He met with President Trump not that long ago. Why did Prime Minister Abe come here so quickly to want to meet with President Trump?
No, thanks very much, Troy, for that question. And I think I was not at all surprised to learn that Prime Minister Abe requested to meet with President Trump soon after President Trump had agreed to this summit meeting, because Japan has some vital security interests at stake. If you all recall the debate that's gone on in the last 12 months about North Korea acquiring ICBM capability and what that means for the United States, well, Japan has been having that debate since 1998, when North Korea developed medium-range missiles that could reach Tokyo. So the fears and the debate going on in the United States is something that's been part of the Japanese discussion now for almost 2 decades. So it's important for us to keep in mind that Japan has its own national interests at stake. The other thing I think that's important to recognize, partly because of the legacy of the Korean War, for decades, U.S. military planning was seeing our military presence in Japan as a safe rear area, safe haven. We could evacuate civilians there. We could do things there with impunity from North Korea. That is no longer the case. And Japan very much recognizes that by hosting a U.S. military presence in Japan, it is placing itself at risk of a potential for a North Korean attack. And so therefore, Japan wants to very much make sure that as the United States talks to North Korea about future security arrangements in the region, that Japan's interests are taken into account. The other area that's of great interest to Japan is cybersecurity, where clearly you have cases of attacks on various financial institutions, critical infrastructure, and Japan is very interested, obviously, in having more certainty and more collaboration with the United States. It's also important to keep in mind that unlike other countries, Japan does not possess any sort of counter-strike capability. So just theoretically, if a U.S. base in Japan were attacked and the missile instead hit a Japanese civilian area and Japanese civilians were killed, Japan has no way of striking back at the source of that attack other than asking the United States for help. So it's a very unique kind of an alliance where you have different capabilities of the alliance partners, and Japan is completely dependent on the United States, on the guarantees the United States has committed. So I'm sure Prime Minister Abe wanted to hear from President Trump that there's no change to the security alliance relationship we have with Japan, and our security assurances would remain in place no matter what sort of agreement he would strike with the North Koreans. And then finally, and this is the issue that made it in the newspaper, but also of great importance for Japan, is the issue of Japanese abductees. And for those of you who are not aware, this stems from the 1980s when North Korean special teams were coming into Japan and kidnapping civilians from beaches and other places, bringing them back to North Korea for various purposes. For many years, the Japanese government didn't believe this, and so the Japanese government feels in a very weak position for talking to family members, because for many years they were denying that this was even a possibility. Then when the North Korean government itself acknowledged they had done these things, of course, it changed the dynamic. So this is an incredibly politically emotional issue. No Japanese prime minister from any party can ignore the interests of these family members. There was an attempt to resolve the issue in the past, and partly successful. But I think Prime Minister Abe also wanted to hear from President Trump that the United States would not ignore these kinds of human rights issues. Now, so far, the United States has always stated to Japan, we believe in human rights. This is a gross violation of someone's human rights to be kidnapped and their life, stolen from them. But obviously, Prime Minister Abe wanted to hear that again, that President Trump would be raising this issue in his talks with North Koreans, and apparently he got those assurances. So I think Prime Minister Abe was happy. The last quick thing I'll mention is there are some domestic political reasons why Prime Minister Abe has his own domestic problems now. His popularity is declining, and showing to the Japanese people that he has a strong relationship with the United States, his big ally in the United States, carries some political benefit for him. I think that last piece, maybe he was a little disappointed in the outcome.
So, Ty, Ambassador Zumwalt mentioned that, Japan would want to make sure that its interests are taken care of. Do you see there being any difference in Japan's security interests as opposed to those of the United States or South Korea?
No, I don't think so. So, Japan and the United States have repeatedly confirmed that we are on the same page with regard to the security issue. And I know that some people argue that it is a nightmare for Japan and probably for the ROK that the United States makes a deal where only nuclear missiles reachable to the United States are addressed and dismantled as a consequence, as an outcome of the deal made by Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un. But I do not think that this is the case.
So, Ambassador Zumwalt, to stick with the U.S.-Japan dynamic, Is there any minimum that you think Japan would need to see from a U.S.-North Korea nuclear deal?
Yes, and as someone who was in the State Department as the United States and its 5 partners were negotiating with Iran, even though Iran is far from Japan, that was a test of our relationship, and the Japanese very strongly felt they should be at the table along with Germany. It was the P5 plus Germany that were negotiating with Iran, and the Japanese felt excluded. They were very anxious that we would be making some kind of a deal that would affect their interests. And obviously, in the case of North Korea, their interests are even much greater. So I think their number one concern is that somehow there be talks and they be excluded. So, for example, a 4-way negotiation, China, U.S., North and South Korea would be very, I don't want to say threatening, but concerning to Japan. And so I think a place at the table is the number one thing they're interested in. Number 2 would be to make sure that the United States is not somehow ignoring or not taking into account some major Japanese security interest.
Ty, I just have one last question on the Japan side of things before we move to the Inter-Korean Summit. If North Korea does denuclearize, what do you see as Japan's role in this process?
Probably many people argue that Japan's role is to pay for the relevant activities and operations that will be conducted by the many players, including IAEA. And I think that could be the part of it, but I do not think that it is everything, or it is the most important thing Japan can do. So my sense is that what Japan should and could contribute the most to the entire process is to require the most strict and substantive criteria for the denuclearization, and work hard to ensure these criteria are kept. Because of course, the process itself has not started yet. But in light of the previous negotiations, I myself and I believe that people in Tokyo are quite concerned if we can make a difference this time to ensure that we have a higher quality of denuclearization this time. And frankly speaking, that South Korea is very much excited with what they have already achieved so far. And, that China and Russia, they do not care, to have the high quality of denuclearization. And the United States is very serious, but, understaffed at the current situation. So, probably, Japan could be the only player which can come up with these criteria, including the test, how to test Kim Jong-un's intent. So in the months to come, what we need to work is to create questions and scoring criteria, and consider and discuss what we give to North Korea when they pass the test, and what we do when they fail to pass the test. So in this sense, that I think that Japan should have and could have the more substantive role to contribute to ensure the high quality of denuclearization.
Well, I think you're exactly right that ultimately this is going to be the key. We have to sort of lay out certain tests, and if they can meet them, then we have to determine what we do going forward. I'd like to turn now to Friday's events, and initially, maybe we'll start with Jung. But I would just kind of like to get very briefly everyone's sort of overarching thoughts on how the summit went on Friday. So, Jung?
I stayed up late to watch it. I don't know who else watched it late night?
I got to watch it live in Seoul, so.
I saw you. On the summit, so I think this, for me, this was the Super Bowl, the Oscars, the Olympics opening ceremonies, and the Bachelor finale all wrapped up into this one event. And I think even the battle-hardened, North Korea skeptics, it was hard not to get excited about it or for the heart to skip a beat. And that was the intent, right? To have the televised, event is to, create a direct relationship from the viewer and what's going on with the two leaders. Who didn't gasp when Kim Jong-un walked down those stairs? Who didn't gasp when they did they jumped over the MDL? Both of them. And who didn't gasp when they heard, Kim's voice unfiltered through its regime media for the first time? So I think it was a remarkable feat for President Moon to go from locked and loaded, and managing those tensions on the U.S. side, but also Kim's belligerence on the other side. And that 6 months later, we're having this particular moment. That said, I think it was a moment, and the hard stuff will come later. But I think in terms of flushing Kim out of his shell, and getting him to say those things that we wanted him to say, was a big deal.
Scott?
Yeah. So, obviously it was a historic moment. It'll go down, in the history books, the image. But I also had a very peculiar thought, as I reflected on, Kim Jong-un walking across, the border. And that is that, to borrow from Greek mythology, that when he crossed the border, Kim Jong-un went from being a god to being a man. And then we saw him as human, right? And there are a lot of risks in the God world to becoming human. And so I think it's interesting to contemplate what he took back with him and what this might mean as a process. But then also clearly, another aspect of this is that this was, Kim Jong-un, orchestrated the broader process, but this was obviously an event that was heavily orchestrated by Seoul and by President Moon. And so I think the other aspect is just reflecting on, what does it mean for Moon Jae-in to put himself at the center of this process. And that is very interesting. It's been very interesting to watch. One thing that strikes me about the way that South Korean diplomacy is playing out that is actually a little bit different from the No Mu-hyun era is that I think that in the No Mu-hyun era, all things being equal, first of all, the South Koreans wanted to be at the center stage, just like they want to be at center stage now. But also, when they had to make a choice between the U.S. and DPRK, I think in the mid-2000s, the concerns tended to be more about we need to avoid ruffling Pyongyang's feelings. And I actually think that so far, and we'll see if this holds, there's been a recognition that in order to make progress, Moon has to have Trump with him. And we'll have to see what that means since we're in the middle of it, how that plays out.
To stick with your ancient world theme, now that Kim Jong-un is human, as an Italian American, there's one crossing that I hope he'll make with President Trump, which is to cross the Rubicon of denuclearization. So perhaps we can have another crossing. Ty, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so of course, this summit meeting was amazing, particularly in light of reconciliation and exchange between the South and North Korean people. But as a Japanese, I deliberately would like to be, a little bit dismissive about the symbolism, including the friendliness of Kim Jong-un and, what he, said and, what performance he, showed. So, for us, Japan and maybe the United States, the important thing is the security. So, in this regard, I believe that, the criteria, to see any arrangement with North Korea should be first, that should contribute to the tension reduction. The second, that should not undermine the deterrence of the United States. And third, that should, of course, contribute to the denuclearization, or at least they should not undermine the effort for denuclearization. The promotion of reconciliation and exchanges between the two Koreas, it is itself contribute to the tension reduction, which is good. The other positive elements I can observe in this joint declaration, for example, they mentioned disarmament, which should be an indispensable component when you talk about the peace regime. And this is the first time, the disarmament was mentioned directly in the joint statement. And also, it refers to the denuclearization. This is also the first time the joint declaration directly refers to the denuclearization. Actually, in the declaration of 2007 between Roh Moo-hyung and Kim Jong-il, it also refers to the steady implementation of, the six-party talks joint statement. So indirectly, at the time, they also refer to the denuclearization, but this time they directly refer to denuclearization. But at the same time, there are concerns from the security perspective on this new declaration. The first, I do not know about the peace regime, the relationship between the peace regime and the denuclearization. The declaration states that this should be addressed this year, but I do not think that this year we can complete the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So how it can be compatible, to have on one side, we have a peace regime, or the declaration of end of the war, and still have North Korea with the nuclear weapons. And second, the disarmament, which was good, but is it a thing that only South Korea can decide? If this disarmament include, anything to involve the U.S. forces, this is quite complex. This declaration is not very clear about the scope. The different disarmaments can be made. And third, it says that implementation of October 4 agreement of 2007. But if it is literally implemented, I suppose that there should be some elements which run against the existing United Nations Security Council resolutions. So how we can think about this. So there are many things actually we need to clear in our course ahead of us. And although this is not the concern of Japan or the United States, but this state declaration clearly mentioned that the peace regime should be discussed among 3 or 4 parties. And for the first time in history, the specific name or the 3 or 4 parties are mentioned here. 3 is U.S. South and North, and 4 is U.S. China and South and North. And I remember that when the 2007 joint declaration was concluded, they also mentioned the 3 and 4, but without the specific names of the countries. And even at the time, I heard that China was not very happy that, they were excluded when it comes to the 3 parties. So I do not know how China would respond to this part of the declaration this time. So like this, there are some points. I do not say the problem, but there are some elements that should be cleared in the near future. And I'm very much interested in actually in concluding this joint declaration. What North Korea did not accept, right? So this should be a kind of product of a compromise. So there are elements that South Korea wanted to have, but North Korea declined. So although these elements could be acceptable, this decline could be acceptable to South Korea, but this could be a deal breaker for the United States. So I'm personally interested in it, and I believe that U.S. should be informed of this part, what North Korea declined to write in this declaration. Thank you.
Mark, any initial brief thoughts?
Yeah, I'd make 3 quick points, I guess. First, this is what the United States always said they wanted. It wasn't very long ago that the position was North Korea would not talk to South Korea because South Korea was just a puppet regime. North Korea said we have to deal with the United States. That's our negotiating partner. We said, the United States, that North Korea needed to talk with South Korea before they could talk to Washington. Now they've done that. So this is what we wanted to happen. Second point is that there's some commentary about how the symbolism and imagery and rhetoric was more important than the substance at Panmunjom, that it was a lot of fluff and not real concrete achievements. I would argue the symbolism and imagery were very important and were very well planned. They were all about Korean history, common Korean symbols, a common background to set the stage for negotiations rather than about competing ideological or economic systems. So there was an appeal there. And the fact that Kim Jong-un came to Panmunjom, the DMZ, rather than insisting the talks be in Pyongyang, was also a concession on his part. Third thing I would say is it was very interesting what Kim Jong-un said during the conversations, as reported, in which he said that what we're talking about is previous agreements that were broken. And if we're going to make progress, we need to go back and honor previous commitments. Well, he was not talking about the 1992 or 2000 pledges to not have nuclear weaponry. He was probably talking about the pledges of economic assistance, interaction, investment. We probably need to go back and look at those previous agreements to see what they actually said, to see what North Korea is going to be asking for now. And one hint of that came when Kim Jong-un kind of remarkably talked about how the road system in North Korea is embarrassing. He said if Moon Jae-in came up to North Korea, he would see the roads were in bad condition. That's quite a concession for a North Korean leader to make. There's a problem in his country. I think the message behind that was, we are in economically tough times because of this unfair international campaign to squeeze our economy. And now we need some help. So I think the hint there was the next talk's going to be about swapping some amount of denuclearization for some amount of economic assistance.
And any brief thoughts, Ambassador Zubal?
Yes, I agree with the previous speakers that, this summit was an important historical moment. Whether it's a historic turning point or not will depend on what comes next. And I think it's important to stress that whether you start at the top and work down or start at the bottom and work up, there's the same amount of hard work in achieving denuclearization that occurs no matter which way you're going. And it's going to be tough and difficult. And I do think there'll be a lot of work ahead of us. A second thing, though, that I think it does bear reminding, and I'm very grateful to Ambassador King, who's sitting up here in the second row, spent so much of his career on North Korean human rights issues. But as a democracy and a nation that believes in human rights and values, I don't think we can ignore our interest in promoting human rights as we talk to North Korea. It doesn't mean we sacrifice other things, but I think focusing only on denuclearization would be a mistake, and we need to be thinking about how we advance our interests in promoting human rights on the peninsula in this process. And then I think just one comment on what my colleague, Mr. Mibai, said about the United States not taking steps to undermine deterrence. I'm kind of intrigued by Kim Jong-un's comment on, perhaps he could accept some U.S. troop presence in South Korea. And this is more of a question than a comment, but I'm just wondering if in his mind there's a divergence between China and North Korea, and that Kim actually sees a U.S. presence in the region as giving him more room to bargain, if you will, with China. And so therefore, there might be some room for some talks about a long-term presence that doesn't undermine U.S. deterrence that North Korea could accept. That's more of a question than a comment, but I do think it's potentially, we shouldn't just assume that North Korean and Chinese interests are the same in this area.
So, John, there's a couple of things I want to ask you about, but I want to start off first with, Mark referenced that Kim Jong-un talked about his disappointment over lack of implementation. And, I'm guessing Mark is probably right that he's not really disappointed that North Korea didn't live up to, its agreement to have a denuclearized Korean Peninsula. But setting that aside, do you think Kim Jong-un can live up to his own standard that whatever's agreed to should actually be implemented?
That assumes that Kim is being sincere, and I'm not in that camp where that he's being. He might think that he's being sincere, but for me, a lot of the other agreements with North Korea fell apart because of verification, and without intrusive verification, we don't know if there's going to be if Kim Jong-un is actually implementing these things. On the prior agreements and, how that he was disappointed due to lack of implementation. I think that, it's also, he gets to decide what comes first. In this discussion about phased approach, U.S. hostile, blaming U.S. hostile policy for everything that he does. We don't get to define what our hostile policy is. Kim gets to decide when our hostile policy is ended or not ended. He can manufacture a crisis and call it's because of U.S. hostile policy. So he puts in putting the onus of onto the U.S. of improving ties and of Moon and toward South Korea for improving ties and living up to these Kim's expectations and implementing these things. I think the key thing is to not let Kim be the driver of demanding what comes first, and that it should be a sequencing. It's a discussion about sequencing that's important. That said, I think the reason that that North Korea walks away from agreements because of verification is because they don't want people inside and showing that they're cheating. And I think that goes to the fact that does Kim really want normalized ties and peaceful coexistence with the U.S.? And I think that's no. Because I think North Korea needs a hostile outside power to justify itself, so that Kim can remain a god standing between annihilation of North Korea and economic and prosperity for the North Koreans by standing up to the U.S. In this way.
So my other question for you is, in essence, the summit laid out a framework for inter-Korean relations going forward. How do you sort of see this framework, and is there anything you would have liked to have seen them done differently?
So I think President Moon has been treating, since the Olympics, inter-Korean ties with velvet gloves. It's a fragile thing that has to be nurtured and insulated. And protected, and try not to ruffle any feathers on all sides, especially Kim Jong-un's, to try to maintain this momentum. But what I would like to see is Kim actually do something that is irreversible, and that we're not talking about family reunions just on a particular date, but that you have an ongoing series of family reunions or ongoing, measures that Kim is willing to take, like just releasing the South Korean hostages that he's holding, or releasing the U.S. detainees there, or changing the way the regime, or dismantling the ideological infrastructure that sustains this U.S. hostile policy narrative. So I wish that there would have been more demands made of Kim to show through action, but so far we've seen just words.
So, Scott, in the declaration, it calls for the prior implementation of inter-Korean agreements, and also it mentions this idea of balanced economic development. Right now, we're still under, maximum pressure and sanctions. So, how do you see this working out while sanctions are still in place?
Well, that's a weak point, I think, and I think it's important to step back and realize that, okay, we have this inter-Korean-led Panmunjom declaration, but it ultimately is really going to be only one part of the architecture that keeps this process moving forward. We're going to be waiting to see what the U.S.-North Korea component of the architecture looks like. I've been sitting here, thinking of analogies, and IKEA furniture has come to mind, and other things like that. Complex tent building instructions. But I mean, you've basically, we need to know what the other part of the framework is. We need to know how they fit together. And I would say that sanctions maintenance is going to be, one weak point that will be tested. And then I think that the other potential challenge that I think we need to think more deeply about is has the reference to complete denuclearization, is it perceived on the North Korean side as a substitute, a kind of weak substitute for their joint statement commitment of 2005? are we seeing a shift in the architecture of grappling with denuclearization in a different direction? I actually think that Kim Jong-un has remarkably enough taken a number of significant steps in terms of voicing self-restraint on testing, in terms of invoking the prospect of a simultaneous process that gets us back to, I think he wants to come back to talks. The question is whether he wants to do anything as part of talks or whether he just wants to come back to talks.
So, Mark, the declaration also talked about the two sides agreeing to hold military-to-military talks. And, it also mentions phased disarmament as tensions are alleviated and confidence is built. Do you think we'll see any of these actual steps prior to the U.S. North Korea summit? Almost maybe as a goodwill gesture. And how do you actually see this process working?
Well, we've seen one. We saw the hotline that was established between South Korea and North Korea already. So that was one step in the right direction. The words that they use about conventional easing of tensions look long term. It looks to me like that's a consequence of denuclearization or other easing of tensions, not a pre-step towards it. That said, a lot of us used to think that the biggest danger of the Korean Peninsula war was not an intentional attack by either side. We thought it was going to be an accident or a mistake. And anything they can do to have hotlines, joint liaisons, maybe withdraw some forces from the DMZ, agree not to have clashes in the northern limit line in the maritime waters, that's good. It's good to avoid that kind of problem. Just for reference, it's good to use the words actually used. Let me read to you two sentences. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me read two sentences from a joint declaration. So it'll be very quick. It's good to see what they actually said. This says, the South and North have agreed to closely work together to put an end to military hostilities, mitigate tensions, and guarantee peace on the Korean Peninsula. The South and North both recognize the need to end the current armistice regime and build a permanent peace regime. Well, that's not bad, but that's from the 2007 joint declaration. So we've heard a lot of this before. A lot's going to depend on how it's implemented. Even the armistice idea is an old idea. We need to see what happens. And the last point I'd make is the role of South Korea in all this, because it's important, as Jung pointed out. South Korea can play a really useful, important role in moderating the conversation in the United States and North Korea. They can explain the American delegation what North Koreans meant when they said things. They can explain to North Koreans what Americans need to do or say, or what their intentions are. But it'll be very awkward if either the United States or North Korea try to push South Korea to the role of being an arbitrator. That would make the talks very difficult. So moderating, yes. Arbitrating, no.
So I want to, in about 10 minutes, move to audience questions. So I want to shift now to the upcoming U.S. North Korea summit. And one of the things, Jung, I'd like to ask you is, everything essentially we're hearing from Kim Jong-un, even if maybe not directly from him, is what we've wanted to hear, that, he'll denuclearize, he wants to end the Korean War, he'll ask not to necessarily end the nuclear umbrella or the removal of U.S. troops from the Korean Peninsula. If that's actually what he discusses with President Trump, can the U.S. afford not to say yes?
I think it would be premature to talk about U.S. troops, but as in the Philippines, if they're, you can't force that, right? So Kim is saying all these nice things, but I think we have to remember that Kim Jong-un in North Korea generally is like a really bad boyfriend, in that he promises all these things. I'll be better. I'll remember your birthday. But, so far, all of those things are just, and it'd be great. And you want to believe. You want to believe that things can get better for the sake of the time you've spent together. We all have to live in the same neighborhood and all of this. But I think that, to talk about removing U.S. troops just because he's saying these things are not, I think that should be off the table. But I think, as Mr. Mibai has said, that we have to continue to test, and to show the action and tie it to the statements. So I think, removing the U.S., having the U.S. to leave the peninsula, I think it's a very premature thing to, think about.
So, Ambassador Zumwalt, if President Trump, because, there has been discussion of this, were to agree to a partial removal of U.S. troops or a full withdrawal, what would that mean for security in Northeast Asia? And do you think that Kim Jong-un, if he went down this road, could ask, because this is something else that we've talked about before, for the removal of U.S. troops from Japan?
I agree that I think it's premature to discuss that. And there are a couple of reasons. One, if you just look at it from purely U.S. point of view, having a forward deployed presence in the region, I'm kind of looking as a set now, not just Korea or in Japan, but that set of capabilities is good for the United States for a variety of reasons. One of which is the security guarantees we have with the Republic of Korea. We cannot meet our obligations to the Republic of Korea without some troop presence. The same goes for our troop presence in Japan. But very frankly, our troops are not only there because of our security alliances. Japan pays so much host nation support that if we were to remove all of our troops from the United States and bring them back from Japan and bring them back to the United States, the U.S. taxpayer would be paying more money than if the troops were left in Japan. So that's just a purely selfish reason why it makes a lot of sense. But also, if you have two allies, you want to be exercising together, operating together, talking to each other. So it would be very hard for us to really sustain our alliance commitments to Japan and Korea without a presence there. But also, let's be frank, another reason our troops are there in the region is because of the concerns we have about the future regarding China. And I think U.S. troops being taken out of Northeast Asia would send a signal to a lot of people, not only Japan and Korea, about the U.S. commitment to Asia. And so I think that I just don't see that as even a remote possibility. But also the question I asked was, I'm not sure that Kim Jong-un himself even wants to see a U.S. withdrawal from the region because of his desire to be able to maneuver, as Mark said, between China and the United States. And if we are withdrawing from the region, that removes us, denies him some maneuvering space. So I'm not even sure that's something he would be demanding as part of a process.
So, Scott, beyond security guarantees, what do you expect North Korea to ask the U.S. for?
Well, I think that the longstanding goal of the North Koreans has been to be treated as a geostrategically weighty actor in Northeast Asia. In a way, I think that what they want to be is the same as China was in the U.S.-Soviet-China triangle. And so, what I think they're going to be looking for is a full affirmation, including guarantees of regime survival. And clearly there's a moral hazard there for the United States because what they mean by guarantees of regime survival, I think, goes well beyond what we or the U.S. Congress would be able to accept given North Korea's human rights record.
So, Jung, recently we've seen in Syria the chemical weapons attack and that it did not live up to its agreement to actually eliminate all of the chemical weapons. How do we avoid something like this happening with North Korea to where they agree to denuclearize and in essence they have a small little stockpile they hide away somewhere, or they keep some of the parts they need to reconstitute the program in secret?
Right. And that's why I think this administration, President Trump and John Bolton have talked about the chemical weapons program as part of this basket of things. Denuclearization, the definition continues to grow, right? It's not just about the fissile material, but it's also the ballistic missiles and now chemical and biological. So, and again, it comes back to the intrusive verifications of North Korea's stockpile and their other activities. And if they were serious about, wanting to, having changed, trying to convince people that they have really changed, it would be, give us a list of all your, where your chemical weapons are stored. Give us a list of where all the missile sites are and all the, where the fissile, materials are stored, that we can cross-check with ours and our allies' lists. So, so we can't, so those guarantees, would have to be, we would also need some intrusive verification.
So, Ty, there's one other element here that we haven't talked about, and that's, could we see an Abe-Kim summit? And as part of any process, it would seem that Japan would need, if it was to normalize relations, the abductee issue to be resolved. So how do you see that affecting the whole process as well then?
First of all, theoretically, I don't think so. I don't see there any possibility that, Abe-Kim summit, is happening. I said theoretically, because I have not seen any indication that, we are going to see a common ground between what North Korea is ready to do and what Japan wants. Well, again, never say never. Who knows? Months before, years before, we have never expected that, the U.S. DPR summit meeting would happen. So, I do not rule out any possibility, but theoretically, I do not, see any, possibility that, Japan DPR summit meeting would happen. And what do you mean that the whole process? You mean that, the entire process, including the U.S. DPRK or the denuclearization. Right?
Yeah. So in other words, if we end up to where, a deal is starting to be formed, and we talked about it inter-Korean as part of a framework, what Japan's role in this would be part of a framework. But if Japan and North Korea can't come to some kind of accommodation, does that then take and potentially pull things off the rails?
So, of course, in general, they're having a more secure region, a more secure peninsula, more secure world, is Japan's own interest. And so by, insisting, Japan's own, interest, related to the human rights issue, the abduction issue, we of course now work very closely with the United States, with ROK, to promote, this, security issue. And, I personally do not see, any possibility that, Japan's, specific issue would be a kind of obstacle, for us to move forward, regarding this security issue.
All right. So
could I just add something there? Just for people to realize, the challenge of saying resolve the abductee issue, it sounds like it's sort of a stroke. It's done. And that's an extremely unlikely scenario. You have essentially the Japanese side saying there are 12 Japanese who've been abducted and we want those 12 people returned. And the Korean side is saying 4 of them never entered North Korea and the other 8 are dead. And so there's kind of a stalemate. And so what resolve means to each side is something very different. And I think what would be required is an agreement to launch a very transparent joint investigation. The North Koreans said, we'll do an investigation. And they came back and said 8 are dead and 4 never came in. It didn't help resolve from Japan's perspective. So I think it might well be a long-term process, but there clearly are people living in North Korea who knew some of these people and who could, if Japanese investigators were allowed to talk to them, at least you might then get to a point where people are satisfied with the outcome. But resolve doesn't mean in a day. It could be a very long process because police investigations can take a very long time, even in a place like the United States.
So, Jong, I have one last question for you before we open up to the audience. We often talk about the Iran nuclear deal, and one of the complaints that, Iran has had with that deal is that U.S. sanctions related to other issues have dulled the economic benefits that it was expecting to receive. The United States also has other sanctions on North Korea. We've recently returned them to the state sponsors of terrorism list. We have human rights related sanctions. Do you see there being a similar issue with any agreement with North Korea?
I think that I'm with Ambassador Zumwalt on this, that human rights has to be folded into any kind of normalization or whatever you want to call it, or relationship with North Korea. The UN itself has said that there is a link between the WMD and the human rights violations, and I find it hard to square the circle of how do you allow the regime to, or how do you believe that the regime wants to reform or do all of these good things and denuclearize if they still have these prison camps and people are still going to be re-educated or punished for rogue economic activities, or saying something against the government. So I think for the North Koreans to show that to show their sincerity has to be part of the human rights has to be a part of that conversation.
All right. I'd like to take and turn to the audience now. If you will take, we'll have mics coming down, but if you will wait for the mic and then if you'll provide your name and affiliation. So we have a question right here.
Yang No Yoon, Foundation for Empowerment. Thank you very much for this exciting event. My first question is about this Jong's comment on the offensive and defensive. Yes, we don't know about Kim Jong-un at all. But as a development economist, I am practically thinking about whether, as my hypothesis, Kim Jong-un is very young. He should go 40 or 50 years. He realized that the North Korean economy cannot go on anymore. And he wants to avoid, for example, Gaddafi's. And of course, Gaddafi, some people would say because of the giving up on the nuclear weapon, he has that kind of end. On the other hand, that's not the cause. As an economist, that is really people's will in the end. He's really a malfunctioning economy and the oppressing regime has ended his. So, in that sense, Kim Jong-un may have realized that he should do something. He cannot go on. And the South Korea is so far beyond North Korea. So that's why he may have come up with this kind of thing, taking advantage of all the matters you have been talking about. And in that context, the sort of corollary question is that partly that's why Kim Jong-un is very much interested in or sort of insinuating the sort of economic, help or, those kind of things. And he went to China and leveraging against the, U.S. for that context. That's my question. Actually, as a Korean, I'm very much interested and I really appreciate the fact that Sasakawa and the KEI are doing together. We are in the same, we are neighbor. One thing we can never change in our life as a human is that we cannot change our neighbor, geographical neighbor. So we should be able to work together and live together with Japan, China, and Korea. So I really appreciate it. Having said that, because there's no Korean here on Korean side, of course, Jong, you are Korean American, but so I add a couple of comments.
If you could just keep them, though, brief so that way.
I'll do that. Mr. Junbal, you said that, Japan is completely dependent on U.S. That's not true to my understanding. Japan has the protection ability. Plus, now Constitution has changed. So we have to take that one into consideration. Second is Korea actually spends a lot of money on having military base in Korea as well. So it's much more than what Trump says. It's much more than what the American citizens believe. And so I think that this issue of the Japanese abductees is so important. And human rights so important, but the sequencing, I guess. So as a Korean, my last proposal is that this is a wonderful forum. I think Mr. Mibae's participation has been so great. I think that it would have been better if Korean side, some Korean who had North Korea could have been there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. So I think there's a couple things I'll pull out of that. One, Ambassador Zumwalt, if you want to talk about the question of, costs that was raised. And then, Jung, she seemed to be, I guess, referencing your comment about, economic issues really driving maybe this. I don't know if you want to comment on that. And if anybody else wants to chime in, do so.
No, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for appreciating the collaboration, because I agree with you. You can't change your neighbors, and it's good for neighbors to get along. And we're neighbors with KEI. Our office is just a block away. So, but on your specific point, I'm glad you asked that question because maybe I wasn't clear. I didn't say Japan has no defense. I said Japan has no counterstrike capability. What I mean by counterstrike is if they are attacked by a North Korean missile, they have no cruise missiles or no offensive capability to strike back. They depend on the United States as their security guarantor to strike back. But you're correct. They have a very robust defense defense capability, but not a counterstrike capability. So it's a very specific point. And lastly, your point on Korean host nation support, I agree. It's very important. Both the Japanese host nation support and the Republic of Korea's host nation support are very important for the maintenance of our presence in the region.
I think we're in agreement that, econ probably plays some part of it. The question is to what extent, this was a defensive, offensive, or, what is that cocktail that led to Kim's engagement? So, I'm in complete agreement with what you said.
Mark.
Just to chime in, Kim Jong-un has always been very clear the economy is very important to him. We've all agreed in every forum that Kim Jong-un's ultimate desire is regime survival. And it seems like the economic situation in North Korea is as important to his survival in the long term as security guarantees. So in the New Year's speech he gave January 2018, he talked about the fact that they've now completed their nuclear program, and now is the time to move the economy forward. So the economy is a very big part of their calculation.
Ambassador King.
Thanks. Particularly interesting discussion. I appreciated the comments on human rights. Question that I have relates to how do we get the North Koreans to make the leap of faith that we're asking them to make in terms of the nuclear denuclearization? What does President Trump have to do to be credible with the North Koreans, particularly as he's raised questions about agreements that we have already negotiated with Iran, with what happened in the case of Libya? What can Trump do to give the North Koreans some assurance that we, in fact, are going to live by whatever commitments we have to make to get the North Koreans to agree to denuclearization?
Anyone want to touch on that one?
He's already, I think, laying the groundwork for that simply by accepting the meeting. And the North Koreans, from their perspective, are going to view it as they should, on a quote-unquote equal footing. And then I think it ends up being about whether or not the North Koreans actually feel that they are making, inroads toward removing their perceived quote-unquote hostile relationship with the U.S. Jong has already provided some pretty compelling evidence why that could be extraordinarily difficult. But because it's an opening negotiating position, I'm willing to actually take the North Koreans, at their word that this would be what they might want, because if they actually got everything that was in their opening negotiating position, they would really have nowhere to go in terms of being able to object. And so as a result, in a way, I think that would be kind of, such an exposure of a record of disingenuousness that even the North Koreans wouldn't be able to take that on board and be able to move forward.
Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I think there'll be two stumbling blocks. First is going to be the definition of denuclearization. The United States knows what it means by that. It means a complete, verifiable, irreversible accusation of North Korea. When Kim Jong-un talks about denuclearization of the North Korean, or the peninsula, all the Korean peninsula, he may be talking about removing the U.S. nuclear umbrella from Japan and South Korea, denuclearize the whole area. So what's meant by that word could be the first problem. The second stumbling block could be timing. If Kim Jong-un says, we're committed to it, it's going to take 10 years. I think President Trump will have difficulty accepting that. I think his time frame is going to be, let's say 2020 for the latest solution to the problem. So timing will be an issue.
Go ahead. Yeah.
If I have a chance to make an advice to President Trump, I would say, in talking to Kim Jong-un, be honest and sincere and polite. Honest means that I should put all the items on the table from the beginning. Now, we are seeing the history of a North Korean nuclear crisis as a history where North Korea unilaterally and constantly cheated us. But from their perspective, they could have seen the history where they were cheated, and particularly, they hate the situation where their counterpart come up with new items or after the conclusion is made. So, if you are to insist, items, including the human rights or, non-nuclear, weapons of mass destruction or, ballistic missiles, you should put all of these things from the beginning, while saying that these are, the things we want to, resolve. And I mean that, sincere, means that, which means, he should not rule out the possibility that, North Korea is rewarded, when they, do, what they want them to do. So this is a very tricky part, which item could be, combined with, which action North Korea takes. So this is a part, where we need a thorough exercise, not internally within the United States, but also among, Japan, U.S, and ROK, or even by including China. Since, we have a very, very deep distrust, with North Korea, I do not, personally, think that, without this sort of, step-by-step or action-for-action process, we can make any difference. And at least, this sort of action-for-action, principle has already been mentioned in the, 2005 joint statement of the six-party talks. And, we say polite, which means that, North Korea is actually, filled with a very, very strong distrust and, inferiority complex, as well as, victim mindset. So, when they come to the place where they need to, particularly to the United States, maybe, Kim Jong-un should have a very strong tense and try to, demonstrate himself as a tough or, bigger person. So in order to ease his tension, I believe that it would be helpful, that Mr. Trump, demonstrate some sort of, how can I say, friendliness, a politeness in talking to him.
I'll just really briefly add one thing that I think that they're going to ask for. Given their own experience with us and what they've seen with Iran, I would not be surprised if they don't ask for some type of congressional buy-in to any agreement to try and avoid this from being something in the future. All right. I saw some hands come up. We'll collect a couple, the lady in the back and then the gentleman here.
Hi, Eun Cho with the Voice of America. My question goes to Scott and Jung. When President Trump sits down with Kim Jong-un, would he be able to make more progress and get some more substance in terms of denuclearization from Kim Jong-un? And National Security Advisor John Bolton over the weekend mentioned about the Libya model again, whereas North Korea said it wants a phased and synchronized model. So would the two sides be able to narrow down their differences during the upcoming summit and following negotiations? Thank you.
And then right here.
Yeah, my name is Kyusuk Jang, working for Christian Broadcasting System in Korea. And my question is going to Ambassador Jumwalt, especially, but I'm very happy to get some comments from other experts. And so yesterday, Michael Pompeo said he is going to require some steps that demonstrate that denuclearization is going to be achieved. So what do you think are going to be the steps? As you mentioned that it is necessary for North Korea to show some meaningful actions. So, and do you think it is meaningful that when North Korea said they are going to close the nuclear test sites and open to the media? So, yes. Thank you.
All right. Scott or Jung?
I mean, that's the, what is it, $10 million, whatever, $64,000 question about what Trump and Kim can do. I really like Scott's comment about how when Kim came down across the MDL that he went from God to human. I think when Trump and Kim meet, they'll both realize that they're both humans. And not Rocket Man versus, mentally deranged dotard. So I think that at least that's a good thing so that you can create some empathy and, understanding and have some sort of, face-to-face interaction. It seems to me that, from President Trump's comments that he thinks that that he, through the force of his personality and his business acumen, can reach this deal with Kim. I think a lot of people are worried that that's just not the case on these questions of what the definition is of denuclearization, our chemical, biological, human rights, all those issues are going to be included in that first conversation. But at the very least, I would. It seems that both sides want the meeting to go well, and for Kim seems to be pointing in that direction. The president seems to be pointing in that direction. On how much progress can there be made, we just don't know. But the devil is in the details on how whatever is said at this meeting, and how that is implemented by the diplomats, the lower level, the working level people.
I agree. This is a very difficult question to answer because we really don't see the bureaucratic process leading up to the summit, and therefore we really don't know very well how the issues are framed. But I think that there are a couple of successes that I can imagine could occur from the meeting. One is the release of the American detainees. This is something that actually probably should have happened already, given the fact that we had a CIA director that went to Pyongyang and came back. Second, I think that both sides in meeting with each other are de facto achieving a cap on conflict escalation, putting some guardrails in place for the relationship. And then I expect that both sides can direct their bureaucracies to start a process that can lead to denuclearization. And the question is whether they can agree to pace, duration, and the elements that would be involved in order to achieve that process.
Ambassador Zumwalt?
No, thank you very much for the question. And I guess it really follows well with Scott's comment that it's pretty unlikely you're going to have President Trump agreeing to a whole series of action for action, step-by-step approach. It's more likely to launch a process that then the two sides' bureaucracies come in and start talking about. But the sorts of initial steps toward a process of denuclearization that would be very hopeful at the beginning were one would be a North Korean declaration of what it has, where it is, what kind of program, and then two, to allow for some neutral parties, the IAEA being the obvious example, to come in and look at these things and see how accurate this declaration is. That would be one initial step that would be a very positive, concrete thing that North Korea could agree to that would demonstrate some seriousness.
Very,
very quickly.
Very quickly. There are three things. There are three things that Kim Jong-un may not. What? Now, there are three things that Kim Jong-un may not understand about Donald Trump. And that could be a problem. Kim Jong-un is a sophisticated actor. He reads the internet. He knows quite a bit about world politics and news, but he may not understand that President Trump will be restrained by Congress. President Trump cannot give them whatever economic aid they want. It's got to be through Congress. The fact that the U.S. is bound by UN Security Council resolutions. We're actually have to change those, to change the way we operate in North Korea. That'll restrain us. And third, Kim Jong-un may not realize that Donald Trump can't stop criticism of North Korean human rights in the United States. He may think that President Trump can order that to happen, but it can't. And then on nuclear weapons, what we can do is an initial step. One idea I've heard I liked was that maybe we could ask Kim Jong-un to turn 2 or 3 nuclear warheads over to a third country, say France, for inspection and disposal. That wouldn't get the IAEA involved right away. It'd be just a gesture, but a concrete one.
All right, so we're very short on time. I'm going to take these questions as a group. We'll start with the lady in the back, and then we'll move to the gentleman here, here, and here. And if you could all keep your questions very short. So, in the back.
Hi, I'm Soyeon Kim from RFA Radio Free Asia. I promise I'll make a really simple question. So, this morning, Trump tweeted that he might be willing to meet Kim in DMZ. And though like Singapore and Switzerland were talked about as most impossible locations somehow. So I'm just wondering where the panels are thinking of the most likely, taking place city for the upcoming summit. Thank you.
The gentleman right here.
Hi, Kevin Hurton, Al Jazeera. This is such a rapid change. I'm just wondering how all this is playing in South Korea domestically, and if there's any challenges politically for some of these rapid changes.
Michael here.
Mike Sedek, PBS online news area. You didn't get to the Libya question. Bolton raised it again. Is he trying to queer the deal before it even starts? Because Gaddafi's dead.
We all die in the end. Florence, you have the last word.
Florence Lowly, Global America Business Institute. Question to Scott. Now we saw Kim Jong-un descent from God to human. Now he has to go back in North Korea where he's still God. So how is he going to balance the humanness and godness in his own country, his own side?
All right, so why don't we do this? Scott, that's specifically for you, but we'll maybe start with Mark and we'll just move down and very briefly with those questions, any last thoughts you might have.
It's on red, you can't hear me. There it is. I like the idea of trying to guess where the summit's going to be. It's like an office pool. That's always kind of entertaining. Yes, we saw the tweet. I'm not a tweetologist, so I can't say what that means about the DMZ. My head says maybe Vladivostok, because it'd be easy to get to, and they give Russia a role. Heart says Ulaanbaatar. I'd love to see it in Mongolia, because there's a country that's been a socialist brother of North Korea and has been a democratizing progressive state. I'd vote for Ulaanbaatar.
So I saw that tweet and I thought, oh my God, it is happening. Because my pet theory is that it's going to be in Pyongyang. I think Trump, the drama and the pageantry of the Panmunjom summit is that I think he might want to one-up that by going actually to.
I already predicted on March 9th Panmunjom, actually. And so I'm going to have to stick with that. Basically, what has happened is that Kim Jong-un went back to North Korea, and the summit was enshrined in the Norodong Shinmun as an act of God.
Anybody on how this is playing domestically? South Korea?
The morning polls say that Moon is at 85%. And so it's been a big success, I think, in the near term for him.
Okay, and then I'll bite on Mike's Libya question real quick and the other one. I actually think that, we tend to think in analogies, and there's this great book called Analogies of War that I read in college, and that when it comes to Libya, that the analogy, there is a specific outcome that we see and that we talk about, but that analogy does not really apply to North Korea for numerous reasons. And I think the North Koreans are very good at utilizing that analogy for public propaganda to say why they need the nuclear weapons. But I think even they understand that the circumstances with Libya are much different. In terms of the process that Bolton is talking about, though, I think and he even said himself that there are differences between Libya and North Korea because of where the programs are. And I think what he's really getting at is that this has to be a quick process like Libya. It can't be a long, drawn-out process. So I don't think he's expecting everything to get on ships tomorrow, but I think he's also saying, as Mark said, 10 years is not going to work. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for coming. If you'll join me in thanking the panel for what's been a really great discussion on this important topic. Thank you.